Welcome to another week of the NFL season, another week of fantasy football sit and start advice from me. I don't really know how my advice is going through the first 3 weeks. It seems like, again, that when I give individual advice on Twitter, it tends to go well. Sure, there's those that don't go so well, but by and large, I seem to provide more productive help than counterproductive help. I don't know so much about these videos. Now, with week number 4, I won't emphasize too much the individual matchups. If you have individual questions, ask me on Twitter, or maybe you already did on the fantasy football Q&A, because I want to focus on some strategies now that the bye weeks have begun here with week number 4 and going forward, and give you some examples of what I've been able to do to capitalize potentially on the panic and mistake of others. Now, with that said, I will give you some general sit-start advice for week number 4. We'll go to quarterbacks. Quarterbacks, maybe to sit. I know some people have picked up Bridgewater and maybe even Bortles this week. I don't know why. Let's see how these rookies are going to look. Let's see how these rookies are going to be utilized by their teams and their offenses before we sit there and start making them our fantasy quarterbacks. This is even with if your guy is on a bye week like a Peyton Manning or an Andy Dalton or a Russell Wilson or what have you. Why are you playing Bortles and Bridgewater? I got to think there are better options available out there for you. But I don't think one of those better options is Cam Newton. I would recommend sitting him this week against Baltimore. I don't know that Cam's 100%. He most certainly didn't play very well Sunday night against the Steelers. I think there's better options out there. In terms of ones to start, I'd say Big Ben against the Buccaneers. I'd assume the Buccaneers will be a little bit better than they were in week number 3. I most certainly would hope so. But, you got to like that matchup for Big Ben. Hell, I'd take Ryan Fitzpatrick if you're in a bye week pinch for Houston, taking on Buffalo. It might be the only time I advise you to start Fitzpatrick this year, but you're talking about a revenge game potentially. They let him go because they drafted E.J. Manuel, basically, and that was going to be their guy. So maybe he'll have a little revenge on his mind. Shit, if you're in a bye week panic and you don't have much better options out there, maybe go after him. Kaepernick for the 49ers, you got to think at some point in time Colin's going to have a breakout game. I'm still hopeful that it'll happen for him, and I think this might be the week against the Eagles defense that really doesn't stop anybody. In terms of running backs with tough matchups this week to sit, maybe Reggie Bush taking on the Jets. The Jets are incredibly tough to run on, and basically with Bush, he's not going to be able to run between the tackles. He's not going to be able to run much, I wouldn't think, on the outside. And in terms of pass-catching opportunities, he might be somewhat limited. Toby Gerhart for the Jaguars, why would you be even starting him at this point in time anyways? But especially, again, another matchup against the Chargers where they could be behind big early. No Toby Gerhart. And Bernard Pierce of the Ravens, if he's back healthy this week, you might have the temptation to start him, assuming he'll be the primary ball carrier. But that backfield in Baltimore is very muddied right now with Pierce and Talafiero and Justin Forsett. You might want to wait a week or two to see how it shakes out before you actively deploy Bernard Pierce. Running backs to start this week, though, Eddie Lacy going against the Bears, I think is a no-brainer. Lacy's been not very good so far this year. You would have to think the matchup is good against the Bears. He'll have a nice day. Stephen Ridley going against a Chiefs defense that isn't stopping the run all that particularly well. Ridley's that featured ball carrier for the Patriots, so I'd assume he'll have a nice day. If you drafted Doug Martin early, which you probably did in the second or third round of your draft, you got to deploy him at some point in time, maybe against a Pittsburgh team that struggles to stop people in the running game. Maybe that's a guy to go with. Wide receivers, I'd say maybe sit Reggie Wayne against the Titans, Riley Cooper against the 49ers, and then maybe Torrey Smith against the Panthers. In terms of wide receivers that I think are probably must-starts this week, DeAndre Hopkins of the Texans taking on the Bills. I think Randall Cobb is a must-start if you have him, because Randall Cobb always seems to have a big day against the Chicago Bears. And if they're not going to move Fuller or Jennings into the slot to match up with them, and even if they do, again, Randall Cobb always seems to have one or two really big plays. One of them always seems to result in a score when he goes against the Bears. You got to go with that history, and you got to assume Cobb will have another nice day. We're talking about revenge games. I mentioned it, hell, with Ryan Fitzpatrick. You most certainly got to go with Steve Smith of the Ravens taking on the Panthers. He's getting a lot of targets from Flacco in that Ravens passing game. You got to think that Steve Smith's really going to want to show what he could do this week. So with revenge on the mind, similar to last week with Deshaun Jackson, I think you got to go with Steve Smith. And then one other receiver, maybe Cordero Patterson. You're hoping with Bridgewater having a better arm, that with Peterson and now Kyle Rudolph out of action, they'll figure out at some point in time, and even North Turner, their offensive coordinator, alluded to it for the Vikings this week, they got to find ways to get this guy the ball in his hands more. And maybe they'll do it this week against an Atlanta defense. Maybe, We'll see, but they need to. In terms of overall things, like in terms of if you're in a pinch and you need a defense for this week, maybe if San Diego's is on your waiver wire, you've got them going against the Jags, so maybe that's a team to go with. But to me, the big thing to focus on here with week number 4, now that bye weeks have started, one thing to do is to not panic and overreact. And what I mean is sometimes you could do yourself more long term good by making a temporary quick fix move than as opposed to if you didn't make that move and maybe you take a temporary loss but a longer term gain. And what I mean is you'll see it now with a lot of people that have several players on a bye this week. They're going to cut players that they probably shouldn't because they're in a panic. They've got 3 or 4 starting spots on their lineup that they feel like they've got to fill because it's all about now, and they've got to win this week because that's the only week that matters. Now, to be fair, if you're 0-3 or 1-2 and in a bad way and you're not scoring a lot of points and your team doesn't look good, you might not have any options. But especially to those teams that are 2-1 or 3-0, do not overreact. Do not panic. This is the time where you can really construct yourself a monster fantasy football team by taking advantage of other people's mistakes, other people's panics. And over the past couple of days, what I'm referring to is the fact that people now with these bye weeks have started to drop players that are hurt, players that are on a bye. And I know I've been sitting there and vulturing them in different leagues off of the waiver wire. Players that I've been able to acquire over the past couple of days doing this are players like Ryan Matthews, players like Jordan Cameron, players like Ben Tate. It doesn't sound like a huge deal. It doesn't sound like I'm adding that much. But in a league where I'm hurting at running back, I was able to add Ben Tate, hoping that he will be the starter for the Browns when he comes back in week 5, which it sounds like he will be. And then Ryan Matthews, who will go back to being the starter for the Chargers when he comes back in a couple of weeks from an injury. I'm sitting in that league in 2-1. I'm really good at wide receiver. I've got a big name quarterback, that I took very late in the draft. It's an individual defensive player league, so my defensive players are pretty good. My team defense is pretty good. But I needed help at running back, both for running back positions and to have more flexibility and options in terms of those flex positions. So now I've been able to take other people's panic and turn it into a strength for me by being able to add a Ryan Matthews. Now I've got another running back on the bench in a couple of weeks that, I was able to get out of the waiver wire, drop a scrub like Sean Green, get a Ryan Matthews somebody else had taken like in the 5th or 6th round. Another league I was in, I saw that somebody dropped Arizona's team defense because they were on a bye. So I sat there, dropped a player on my bench that was probably never going to see the light of day, and I decided to pick up Arizona's defense. I don't like their Week 5 matchup against Denver, but they have plenty of games where the matchup is pretty good, especially towards the end of the season as you get into fantasy football playoff time. My point is don't overreact too much to the bye weeks. Don't make so many drastic moves that it impacts your team long term. Because here's what's going to happen. You'll see lots of people that have, let's say in deeper roster leagues, you've got 5, 6 players on a bye week in your starting lineup, but then maybe another 2 or 3 on the bench. And you'll see people like this. And then they'll drop a shit ton of people just to add people for 1 week. And they could find themselves, in theory, with bye weeks, right back in that position again in another week or 2. Why are you doing that? You're making your roster too fluid, and you're going to end up costing yourself more than you're going to benefit from it. If you're in a position where you've got a ton of people on a bye week, but you like that construction of your team and you're in a decent place right now, I might advocate, I don't want to say throwing the week, but I would advocate not doing much. And if you do something, like I said, look for people that are dropping people like Noshawn Moreno. Look for people that are dropping Ryan Matthews and those type of players, those that are injured. Maybe somebody's going to panic and they're going to drop Josh Gordon because they feel like they have to win because they're 0-3 or they're 1-2 and in a bad way. These are the type of players that you can pick up that you didn't draft, that somebody else spent a high draft pick on in a lot of cases, that could sit there on the bench, add to your depth on your bench, and put you in a great position of power either to have that depth throughout the season to cover for injuries, what have you. Get these highly productive players at a position that otherwise you wouldn't have been able to because you didn't draft them. Or even more importantly, over the next few weeks, now the trade cycle really starts in fantasy football, especially as people start to see what the strengths and weaknesses of their teams are. People start to panic and overreact due to bye weeks and where they are in the standings. Now you add those players like the Morenos and the Matthews of the world or Arizona's defense. These are the type of pieces that maybe you could throw out there in a trade and they could bring you back a big return, a big time wide receiver or a big time running back. It sounds stupid maybe, but it happens every year in leagues all over the place. So I advise you, as important as it is to manage your starting lineups for week number 4, it's important to look at your big picture for your team and your league as a whole. See what's sitting out there on your waiver wire. See where your strengths and weaknesses are. Take advantage of these opportunities that are being presented to you, because I assure you, people are going to overreact. People are going to panic. People are going to cut players that they should not cut due to injuries or lack of production. And that's where you can swoop in and vulture yourself some big time difference makers that could really help you out as your fantasy football season progresses. If you have any other fantasy football questions, you can tweet them to me at pfspot_Schlegel. Hopefully I gave you some good advice for week number 4. We'll see. But I think the bigger takeaway from me this week, more so than the individual sit starts, is that you need to get on the waiver wires and you need to manage your things. In terms of other guys to maybe pay attention to on the waiver wire, I say guys like Kyrie Robinson of the Saints. He's taking over for Mark Ingram. He'll get some goal line touches. Maybe if you're in a really bad way, a guy like a Denard Robinson for the Jaguars. If you're in a league where wide receivers don't score much, but running backs score more, and leagues are like that. Denard Robinson in a lot of leagues is classified as a wide receiver, not a running back, but he's a guy that could get more carries as the season progresses instead of Toby Gerhart. Running backs like D'Angelo Williams, who will be starting, I think, in week number 4. Guys like Ben Tate that I previously referenced. Maybe if you're not sure about Doug Martin and Bobby Rainey's out there because somebody dropped him because they need to fill something else because Doug Martin's coming back. Maybe a Bobby Rainey. Knowing Doug Martin's injury history, it might be wise to hold on to Rainey. Wide receivers like Jeremy Curley and Allen Robinson. Hell, I'd even say Marquise Lee for the Jaguars. This is a time you can get some players that can help you long term. I don't want you guys, though, to overreact and panic just to 1 week because you got a bunch of buys and you feel like you just have to win this week. 1 week does not a season make in terms of if you lose it, that's it. But it can be your entire season if you overreact and you panic and you make some terrible moves that can impact you for the rest of the season.